I see you found our little hiding spot in the universe. Don't get too comfortable. This is a place where you will find those with an experience that's out of this world, or possibly deep within your life. I welcome you to the Oracles with James Tyson. Lean forward and listen. We will pull you into a supernatural journey with guests from around the world, each one experiencing some of the most extraordinary phenomena this wee planet has to offer. Now, here are the Oracles with James Tyson.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you, listener, for tuning into this episode of the Oracles with James Tyson. I am James Tyson, and today I bring you Jefferson Davis. Okay, not that Jefferson Davis, actually Jeff Davis. We are going to talk about the Vancouver Barracks. Now, this isn't Vancouver, British Columbia. This is Vancouver, Washington, just across the border from Oregon State. For those of you who are directionally challenged, it's just north of Oregon. There's a line that they use for the border, and it's on the other side. So it's in the southwest corner of Washington State. Named after the same Yahoo, George Vancouver, who was mapping up and down here in the Pacific Northwest on the coast and thought he was the first person around here. So ignoring all the First Nations people, he thought he'd just go out and name things after himself. What wasn't named after himself? It was named after, I grew up on an island actually named after his favorite dancehall girl, Lulu Sweet. So yes, I grew up on Lulu Island. Captain Vancouver also was up here around the time, or a little before the time, of Hudson's Bay Company. And the Hudson's Bay Company started a fort not too far from where I live called Fort Langley, and at the same time started Fort Vancouver. And later on, not too far away from the Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Vancouver in what's now Vancouver, Washington, was created the Vancouver Barracks, a small military base, really just a military presence out there, because it was a bit of a disputed area here on the Pacific Northwest coast. We're going to talk to Jeff about his experience at the Vancouver Barracks, and he does a ghost tour there. If we go to his website, which is ghostsandcritters.com. So if you're playing along at home, please go to ghostsandcritters.com and click on main, and then click on the little, I guess it's an icon. It's Spirit Tours. And it'll give you an idea of what Jeff does. And I started off June 1st, and they go to the end of November. It takes you on a walk through all the old haunted places down around the old Vancouver Barracks. And as a kid, he used to actually hang around down there, so that's kind of interesting. We're going to talk to him a little bit about the migration out to that part of the world, too, along the Oregon Trail, whether it's up through Grants Pass. We'll touch on a little bit of the European immigration to that part of the world back in the mid-1800s. A little bit on Custer's last stand, too, because he's got some association with some of the people from that time who ended up out in the Washington State and out in the Vancouver area. Jeff has written a number of books on the paranormal, particularly up here in the Pacific Northwest. He's written Ghosts and Strange Critters of Washington and Oregon, Ghost Critters and Sacred Places of Washington and Oregon, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, Haunted Astoria, Haunted Tour Guide to the Pacific Northwest, Portland Rose, City Ghosts, and Vancouver, USA Ghosts. And that's not all. He's actually contributed or written a substantial amount in the Weird books, Weird England, Weird Hauntings, Weird Oregon, and Weird Washington. Jeff is an interesting character himself. He spent a 32-year career in the U.S. military and Army Reserves. And on behalf of everybody who likes to sleep in on a Saturday, be able to scratch their tummy, get up and cut their lawn without fear of somebody either blowing them up or some government imposing their will on our day-to-day life. We'd like to thank Jeff and particularly all his comrades who didn't make it back home after their deployments in the military. So a hat tip to Jeff, who worked his way up from a private to a commissioned officer in the U.S. military. Thanks again, Jeff. Jeff is a historian and archaeologist. He received a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. And in the 90s, he lived in England for nearly a year, where he studied archaeology at the University of Sheffield, where he eventually received his master's in archaeology and prehistory. He's a pretty in-touch guy when it comes to digging into the facts of things. So his books are quite entertaining and educational, which kind of freaks me out anytime anyone says, oh my God, that book's, I learned a lot. And I go, damn, am I going to read that? Yes, I am, because it has pictures in it. All his books that I have, and I have pretty well all of them, they're about anywhere from, I think the smallest one here is Portland's Rose City Ghosts, Volume 1, which is only about 90 pages long. The rest are about double that. They're about 180 plus pages. So they're a good afternoon read. I leave them to the afternoon or the morning, but I'll read them really late at night. They're a little bit spooky because that's kind of the guy Jeff is. Well, I shouldn't say he's spooky. He's been around a lot of spooky places, and he comes in with a little bit of a skepticism because he hasn't actually seen a full-on ghost walk up to him or do anything, but he's been around when weird things happen, and he puts on this spirit tour in the Vancouver Barracks in Vancouver, Washington, and stuff happened to the other people too. Things go off, lights dim, things flicker that aren't supposed to flicker, which is just the way Jeff lives. He's lived in the peculiar world for most of his life. As a boy, he decided to become an archaeologist and investigate old and unusual things after watching the original Mummy movie with Boris Karloff. So let your kids watch spooky movies and really old ones, because look what happened. He's got a master's in archaeology from watching a movie, the old Mummy movie, in black and white. Amazing. And for many years, as a young man, he worked in the woods of the Pacific Northwest and Cascade Mountains, which is home of Bigfoot. So he's heard all the stories about what's going on out there. He's encountered many peculiar things while traveling around the world, from England, Italy, Bosnia, South Korea, Japan, Southwest Asia. And again, he's written and edited or contributed to over a dozen books, including military history and the paranormal. He's a fascinating guy. Jeff, how you been?
James, I am doing great. How about yourself?
I am doing really well. I'm getting ready to go down to the Preston Castle next week in Northern California, just out of south of Sacramento, doing a bit of a tour down there, and then leave from there to Alien Con in LA for the end of June. So I'm kind of looking forward to that road trip. So I'll be driving past you in around Vancouver, Washington, and waving frantically as I'm trying to get down south a little bit quicker than I should. But yeah, it should be a good little tour.
Yeah, and you know the third stop is of course waiting for the mothership to pick you up.
Yeah, that's, and if it doesn't, I'm heading off to Phoenix in September for the International UFO Congress, which always sounds like a good communist group. We're having a congress. We're not having a conference. We're having a congress. It's a good socialist way of putting things.
Isn't that a group of baboons called a congress?
Yeah, I think it's a congress of baboons and an army of gorillas or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's why the gorillas always took over the congress.
Yeah, well, of course, the favorite is a murder of crows.
A murder of crows, a drift of swines, a business of ferrets. I have no idea why I know all this. No, it's an army of frogs. It was a band of gorillas. That's what it was. Army of frogs, band of gorillas. And and I'm thinking a congress of baboons, which is, if you ever looked at Congress and looked at a group of baboons, well, that's a whole other issue. One of the things that I wanted to touch on, and for those of you who are just jumping in and didn't hear me give out the website in the first part of the show here, if you want to follow along, go to www.ghostsandcritters.com, ghosts plural, and critters.com, and go to Jeff Davis's website here. And what I want to talk about is you have ghost walks. Now, how long have you been doing the ghost walks down in Vancouver?
Well, I should say Vancouver, USA, because I'm sure you're heard in Canada too.
Yeah, Vancouver, Washington, yeah.
And commercially, as a regularly scheduled business, I'm only starting my third year, but I've been doing the walks down there off and on for friends and special occasions. Gosh, 7-8 years. See, I was my dad was stationed at the barracks, the Vancouver Barracks, and so was I. And that's the setting for the walks, is the U.S. Army's Vancouver Barracks, which was established in 1849 in part of the move to chase those pesky Hudson's Bay Company British and French Canadians out of good old American territory.
And the Samoans. Or the
Hawaiians.
Yeah.
Hawaiians.
Kanaka.
Kanakans, yeah. It's and I say that jokingly. The whole for those people who are not from kind of the Pacific Northwest, and I include Canada in this, it was disputed territory from Alaska all the way to was the Northern California border. Was the part of it was the Oregon country. And it was openly disputed by the United States, Spain, and in Great Britain as to whose territory it was. Not that the native folk who lived there had a voice in this.
No.
And they didn't really settle it until the mid-1840s.
It was fascinating. The Cascadia, I always like to refer to it as Cascadia. We should actually break away from everybody else anyway. It was fascinating. We have a fort here called Fort Langley, and it was a Hudson's Bay Company fort. And the next fort down was Fort Vancouver. And wasn't there another one on the other side of the Columbia River too, in the Oregon side?
Well, it's one of these over time kind of yes and no answers. During the War of 1812, in what's now Astoria, there was a Northwest Fur Company, which is essentially British interest there, but the Astor Fur Company, who were Americans, established Fort Astor, and then the War of 1812 happened, and the Americans got frightened that the British Navy would be arriving to dispossess them, so they sold all U.S. interests to the Northwest Fur Company, and so they renamed it Fort George, and it was in the 1820s that the chief factor decided to move the main operations center from Fort George, and they established Fort Vancouver, and that operated as the regional headquarters. By this time, as all Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest, and Hudson had merged, and they had all these little satellite forts, which were mostly trading posts. They still kept something in Astoria. They had something up at Nisqually, Washington, and also up toward the tip of the Puget Sound as well.
Okay. Now, when you say the Astor Food Company, the Astor Fur, was that where they got the name Astoria from?
It is.
Yeah, okay.
It is.
That's interesting.
And John Jacob Astor, and who himself, even though the family is still fabulously wealthy today, their foundation was it John Jacob or just John Astor, started off as a fur trader, and he worked his way up through the British fur system, and then broke away and established his own, and that was the foundation for the current, Astor Hotel and everything on the East Coast.
Yeah, he was one of those guys. One of the Astor families actually died on the Titanic.
Yes.
What's it? The fourth. That was one of those families that had like John the Third, John the First, John the Second, John the Fourth. I think it was the fourth or the fifth that died on the Titanic. What a lovely industrialist family.
Yeah, just come to North America and push everybody out of your way. And and I make jokes about this, but the Oregon Trail, which part of the reason the U.S. Army arrived on just upslope of the Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Vancouver, the Army expedition arrived in 1849, and towed their cannons up to the kind of the top of this rise overlooking the Fort Vancouver, and then they turned the cannons around and pointed them directly at the Hudson's Bay Company stockade. like in the middle of the night they did that.
At the stockade. Interesting.
Yeah, which was Fort Vancouver. The Hudson's Bay Company had a wooden stockade that was mostly to keep everybody from breaking into the warehouses and stealing all the trade goods.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and as the American settlers moved in, they did build kind of a tower, and they did have some cannon, but not as big as what the Americans brought. But people coming across the Oregon Trail, and you want to talk about, since we are talking about the odd, unusual, and ghosts, essentially from the late 1830s until the Transcontinental Railroad, a period of about 30 years, somebody can cross-check the dates, people traveling from Independence, Missouri, along the Oregon Trail, and then getting off in various other sub-trails, but 10% of the people who took it died along the way. That's a statistical estimate. That's pretty firm. And can you imagine being one of these people who, say, it's now 1850, people have been traveling the Oregon Trail for 15, 20 years now, so it's pretty firm. Everybody knows, look to your left, look to your right, and one of these people isn't going to be there at the end of the road, and yet they still traveled the route.
Mm-hmm.
I'm convinced by the end of this, most of these people were not quite sane at the end of the trip because of the hardship and the stress.
Yeah, and I agree, because people put under a lot of stress, and we think of some people with post-traumatic stress issues, challenges now, from seeing things or having to do things that their bodies aren't, and their minds aren't prepared to do. And a march like that, or literally a wagon train and a walk like that across the country, seeing death and going through those extremes would really, really put a toll on you mentally, and that would connect to you forever. It's something you're not going to get out of your system.
Yeah, I agree, and this can account for how kind of, to use the term, despotic some of these people who made that Oregon Trail. They got to this end, and the thing that kept them alive was the thought of that half section of land, 1 mile by 1/2 mile rectangle, and what could they do with it? I'm going to plat a town, and I'm going to name it after myself. I'll be king of the world. Mm-hmm. And they didn't let anybody stand in their way.
Yeah, and I find a lot of them came out here to look not only for land, but to think that, well, it's unexplored. I'm going to come out here, make my fortune, and then go back home and live in the city. So a lot of the buildings that we have here on the West Coast were made out of wood, because that was our number one building material out here. But these people all moved from stone and brick homes in the East. So it's not like we have a lot of built history that still exists, unless it hasn't caught fire, and it's been it's been upkept. But a lot of the very, very wealthy people would have a great big brick home or stone home because, darn it, I'm going to live here. And then a lot of the employees came out and they were trying to make their fortune, and they lived in a wooden house that was only going to last 50, 60, 70 years, maybe. They weren't planning. It appears. Now, I'm just throwing this out to you. You're the archaeologist. You can, in your experience, that I don't know. Is there something to that?
I think so. All of these original homes that they had to build, of course, you're absolutely right. You can't get dressed stone or bricks until decades later, and so your first house is going to be whatever material. I think too, some of these folk who became rich, they just went ahead and by the 1880s or 90s, went ahead and just demolished their original house and rebuilt right on the site. So that's another reason why we don't have some of these original homestead homes, is because the people just replaced them, which is something we do today. Mm-hmm. If you end up buying a house in a house lot and you make it big and you don't want to necessarily move, so you just move out of your house and have somebody demolish it, and when you come back from vacation, hopefully it's finished.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, unless you got my contractor.
Or what that guy used to be on Murphy Brown, who just was constantly there.
Yeah.
His name. Yeah, the Oregon Trail is a fascinating. I remember it was an episode of some ancestry thing where Kelsey Grammer, one of his relatives, had come out on the Oregon Trail. Actually, his family came out, and one of them died and was buried somewhere along the Oregon Trail as a young man. But imagine, that entire trail is filled with unmarked graves.
Yes, and a lot of people sporadically over the years who now live adjacent to the old trail. Every so often you hear, well, I saw the ghost of the pioneers taking the trail.
Well,
and
do you think,
yeah.
now, in your experience with you being, a pretty skookum investigator, do you think that's a residual energy, or would you think that is actually the spirit of somebody, a ghost?
I'm more inclined to believe it's residual energy because the specters that people see, the apparitions, don't seem to be paying attention to anything. And sometimes the more dramatic narratives take place at dark or at dawn. And in real life, the people traveling the trail probably would have been bedded down at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. It's just the energy output for so much time at that location and that time. It's like in Bath in England, they say that there's Roman soldiers who had been in the UK, or what's now the UK, for a few hundred years. You could see them walking as a group on a patrol in one of the towns there, but they only saw them. It was like their knees were coming out of the ground. It was like they only saw them from the knees up. So they would have been walking on the original road. So
yeah,
that would have been residual energy from just repetitive.
Yeah, I think so too. That's probably from the city of York, if I recall that one, where in the basement there was a plumber or an electrician working in the basement, and he ended up seeing Roman legion or auxiliaries marching. I just got back from the UK about 2 weeks ago. If anyone does go see the city of Bath and the Roman baths, one of the kind of nifty things that they've done is hard to visualize this because you and I are just talking audio, but the Roman baths, the floors where the people were walking were raised platforms, and underneath the floor were a series of pillars, and the ancient Romans would light fires underneath these pillars, and that would heat the floor. Very, very quote modern. And so what they've done as far as interpretation goes is us tourists are looking, we can see all the hypostyle pillars and kind of what's left of the floor. And what the museum people have done is they have placed glass panels at floor level, and they're playing kind of holographic movies on the glass panels, having people reenact being in a Roman bath.
Oh, okay.
And they're sort of transparent, so it does have this ghostly feel to it too.
Oh, great.
And for those people who think it's some kind of Roman baths, naked people, I'm not sure if this was by choice, but those people who are like closest to the camera and the most in focus are all older than me, and so you get these pudgy middle-aged bodies, not quite the kind of orgy effect that some people might visualize with a Roman bath.
Oh, lovely. One day we should talk. We're on kind of the Oregon Trail. We should really talk about. Not today though, because I really want to stick with your tours and then get into your series, The Critters and Sacred Places of Washington and Oregon. The whole Grants Pass Donner Party cannibalism thing that probably threw a shock into some of the people back then, and there'd be some residual energy hanging around from that. But Yeah, that would be kind of a creepy place to go to, where that happened.
Yeah. Since we're kind of talking in this vein as a later talk, yeah, and along the Oregon Trail, there is one kind of, to me, famous account where pioneers in what's now Eastern Oregon got kind of stuck along the trail, and they were eating each other too. And there's an association with a guy named Marcus Reno, who ended up getting the major blame historically for Custer's last stand.
Oh, Reno. Yeah, he was. Yeah. He wasn't he an officer or a?
Yeah, he was a senior officer surviving. He was a major.
He was. He stayed away. He was a couple of miles to the southeast.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty complex situation of what happened. Reno, Custer had divided his forces, and he gave Reno command of a few companies and said, "You're making the diversion. You come down this way and try and attack the camp, and then let them push you out. But you have to make a stand in this location, and you while they're paying attention to you, I'm going to go around and attack the camp from a different direction." And so Reno and his men did make their feint, and then they pulled back. And here's where he gets the blame, in that at a certain point he felt they were going to be overwhelmed, and so he took his men out of the valley up into the hills for safety, and so the natives turned around and went after Custer. And so some people say Reno should have held on just a couple minutes longer, and then Custer would have been able to make his move. It's armchair quarterbacking on a massive level. Yeah,
when I was standing on the top of the hill where Custer fell, you could see to the southeast the high ground where Reno's men were just on the other side of it. And I guess Custer had tried to send somebody to get them to come back in, but there was either the guy didn't make it, I can't remember what the story was, but they stayed there. And didn't move in.
Yeah, and it became it's so sad because they're all victims, they're all dead, and yet as a military historian, I'm fascinated by the way modern people with an interest in military history, credentialed military historians and just ordinary people with an interest, hobbyists, how every single nuance and gesture seems to be retold with significance as to what went wrong. It's amazing. And I've actually am friends with some of the collateral descendants of the extended Custer family. Custer had several sisters and brothers. One of his sisters, Margaret, or Maggie, married a guy named James Calhoun, and he and his company died. There's a place called Calhoun Hill, and that's where they died. Now, James Calhoun had a brother, Fred, who was also in the Army, and who was also had stayed over and knew George Armstrong Custer very well. And he was somewhere else on the battlefield, but later he married Custer's niece. So he was his own uncle and nephew-in-law at the same time. But he kept kind of a log of what happened, and his wife kept detailed household accounts. And so I consolidated those for publication. Anyway, I take us way far away from the ghosts, don't I?
Hey, those people are all dead, and they some of them may be ghosts. And being on the battleground, a little bighorn, there's some feelings you get there. You get a sense that there's still people wandering around there that are a bit lost, or they're still holding a position. I guess is the best way of putting it. The anxiety. You can feel anxiety in certain locations.
Yeah,
I would have loved to wander a little bit more, but every one of those signs that say "watch for rattlesnakes," I kind of push me back on the path.
Yeah, and it's important to remember too that yes, indeed, I felt that anxiety too. But at the same time, as it's a place of tragedy for fans of the United States Army, is actually a kind of a place of celebration for a lot of the native people too.
Jeff, what got you into the ghost side of archaeology? What events happened that sparked that interest?
A lot of people, apparently not me, but a lot of people have paranormal experiences, and that's kind of an awakening for them that, oh my God, I saw something, and then they get curious, and then it becomes something very important to them, more than a hobby, more of a lifestyle change. In my case, I've always been interested in the paranormal. I've never seen an apparition, and so maybe wanting to have that stuff happen brought me into it. And my dad was stationed at the Vancouver Barracks, and at the age of 17, I enlisted in the Army Reserves at the barracks, and I put in a 32-year career. And currently, the Vancouver Barracks are the Army left a couple of years ago, and the city of Vancouver owns a portion of it. The National Park Service owns a portion of it. And before the Army left, I was the last person to actually have an office there. I was one of the last military people there, turn off the lights and lock the door kind of thing. And when I try and talk history to people, I think everybody is interested in history. How deep is the interest? And some of that depends on how bad their history professors were. I'm sure you met people who can make history as boring as curdled milk.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I found is that, I like ghosts. I treat them as an anthropologist. I do folklore and stories, and they serve a purpose. Ghost stories serve a purpose in our society in many different ways. But the physicality, virtually every culture in the world believes something happens and believes in ghosts. So as a teaching point, why not teach people a little bit of history at the same time as you entertain them with ghost stories?
When you do your ghost walks, and I see they as you say, they've started up here. They go from June 1st to November 31st at the Vancouver Barracks. Have you heard anything? Like you say, you haven't seen anything, but do you hear things? Do you feel things? Do people around you point out certain things that you can almost see? It's fascinating to me because I haven't been to that connected that way or disconnected that way for a long time. I still bump into things or I feel them or hear them. But being in such a location like that and being up on all the history in the building itself, is there anything that you feel when you walk through there?
Yes, absolutely. Just because I haven't seen an apparition doesn't mean I haven't had just about everything else happen to me at the barracks and other places. And so, yes, I've had things happen. And when I do the walks, I try and be very, very clear to people that this happened to me or this happened to somebody I know. The further away from myself or somebody I know, that when it becomes a friend of a friend, I try not to even share those stories because, internet legends and things like that. Mm-hmm. Having told you that, I usually start the tour on the parade ground or at least pointing toward the parade ground with my patrons. And the ghost story there, when I originally came across it, I thought this has got to be an urban legend. The way the urban legend feeling came about to me was I found this same story written nearly identical on 3 different websites. So I'm contrary to believe. If it's on the internet, it must be true. When I find the identical story, that to me just means 2 or 3 other people have copied the original. But there are some other little testimonials that were online about other people seeing a ghostly sentry. wearing a dark blue jacket, light blue pants, with a very tall rifle and a bayonet, challenging people. So I looked into that story, and just because I'm a military historian and spent all that time in uniform doesn't mean that I know everything automatically. And that's the nice thing for me about doing these tours and talking to people and hearing stories. It gives me an excuse to now start doing historic research, to look to see if there's anything historically factual related. The word correlation. Is there anything that happened with the sentries, or were there even sentries? Because you walk around the Vancouver Barracks today, it looks very, very sedate and calm. And yet when I started looking backward through time, I found out that, yes, there were sentries. They were guarding, among other things, there was a guardhouse. And these guys were not just ornamental. There were several instances where prisoners escaped from the guardhouse, and 3 prisoners were shot at right there on the parade ground, which was kind of a surprise to me as I'm doing this research and looking at the newspaper back files. And there were other correlation and facts that suggest that, yes, indeed, even one of the sentries committed suicide. And so this, then you never prove, you can't even prove ghosts exist or don't exist. But it is really interesting if this is a coincidence on some of these details. It's a mighty coincidental coincidence.
Yeah. It's funny. My show here is we just take it for granted there are ghosts. We never have to prove it. Yeah, I've seen them. And if you haven't, well, it's one of those things. It's just what the heck they are, and that's the curious part. But if you have, you've got somebody who's a guard who's been involved in not only is this person been involved in very stressful situations, but there are those reasons people don't cross over, and one of them is that they still perceive they have work to do. And that could be your guy. It doesn't sound like a residual if he's actually challenging every tourist that shows up there. But who knows? It would be really, really interesting to go talk to him. Yeah.
So far, nobody has. But I think some people have tried. Mixed in with that, to me, is kind of funny. The Vancouver Barracks is also really, really popular for Pokemon Go. So sometimes I kind of see the Pokemon Go people. I have not yet seen them wandering through the fog, but if anyone is going to resemble a ghost in the fog, I think it's going to be a slow-moving Pokemon Go person.
That is funny. That's kind of funny. We're talking to Jeff Davis. He is an author of many, many books about spiritual activity or ghost activity and all sorts of paranormal in the Pacific Northwest, or as what we like to call in this chunk of Canada, the Pacific Southwest, because that's where we are. Follow him on his website, ghostsandcritters.com, and that's kind of what I'm at right now. I'm looking at his walk of, it's called Spirit Tales of the Vancouver Barracks. In your history that you've done on those barracks, you've obviously, we're talking about the sentry, and the sentry's activity with confronting people and actually engaging in people escaping and the unfortunate suicide. Is there anything else in that barracks that popped up in your investigation in the history of the building?
Well, yes. Since you and I are talking about the Spirit Tales, when somebody goes on my website, at the main page there'll be a little icon, a little photo that says Spirit Tales, and there's a photograph of an old building. And I took the original picture using infrared film back when cameras had film, and that building is known as the Grant House. And it's named after Ulysses S. Grant, famously because he never lived there. Yet they named it after him for various reasons. You have to take the tour to find out. Yeah. But it has several resident ghosts, and one of them has been active for after several years of not being perceived by people. But last year, on 2 separate occasions, people saw the lady in blue, or the blue lady, who is a supposed to be very tall, wearing a blue dress, obviously, with long hair. And this is another one of these stories that I had just heard of second or third hand. I start the tour not too far from the Grant House, and I talked to the staff there many times about ghosts, and they'd not talked about her. It was more or less on the internet that she's been seen affiliated with parties and things like that. And yet last year, two separate people, totally unrelated, who didn't know of the legend of the Blue Lady, both claimed to have seen her. In one instance, she appeared to a customer who was eating dinner. The Grant House is a restaurant now, and they actually made eye contact.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I would consider that interaction. And the other famous ghost at the Grant House is General Alfred Sully. And numerous people in the last 10 or 15 years have interacted with him. And it's the case like the movies love to portray, where somebody goes ahead and talks to him, and then he says, "Okay, I'll be back in a minute," and he walks around the corner, and they follow him, and he's disappeared. And that's happened to several different people in different circumstances.
Interesting. That is so cool.
Yeah,
I really like those kind of stories. And what is also cool, you and I have a friend named Skeeter Wellhouse. She's a psychic, and she kind of shows up at the same conferences we do, and she does her talks. Skeeter does stuff remotely. So here's kind of a thing for you. If you're doing, and now you have a podcast, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you,
yes, I do.
Tell my listener what your podcast is.
Oh, it's Jeff Davis's Peculiar World.
And if you are basically going to do it, let's say, if you could get into one of these buildings that are haunted, and you're doing it in there, and whether it's pre-recorded or not, if you actually call Skeeter on her phone and not tell her where you are, she will literally take a deep breath and show up there remotely. And to prove that she's actually there, she'll describe the inside of the building for you. And she will identify a ghost, ask them to come over, and you could interview the ghost.
Interesting.
We've done that a number of times. We usually do it when somebody's got a house that's got a ghost in it and they want it out of there. So I do the interview of the ghost through Skeeter and determine why they're there and what their connection is to the building, and then we either cross them over or talk to the owner, who's on the phone with us, usually freaking out because Skeeter's telling them where they're sitting in the house and what's going on, like what's on the walls and what's down the hall and things, and they're kind of freaking a bit because Skeeter's describing the entire interior of the house that neither she or I've been to, and then describing the ghosts that they've seen without knowing what the ghost, she's kept out of that part of the conversation. But that would be an interesting thing to do on your podcast, is in one of these buildings and have her remotely show up, and again, not tell her what your building is or anything of the history behind it. And then just have her say, "Yeah, there's a guy in uniform. He's so and so." And you say, "What is his name?" And get the name from the guy and ask him why he's there. It's fascinating. It's very, very fascinating, the stuff that she does.
Yeah, I myself would have been satisfied with asking her, which nostril am I picking right now?
Heck, if you had to pick your nose, would you pick that one? The types of spirits that you run into. Now, you are a military historian. You have great connection to these buildings. And what I've done is, while I'm sitting here on the computer, I actually took that photograph of the Grant House and blew it up on my computer to see if I could see anything in the windows. And of course I do, because my brain tells me I should see something there. Therefore, I make mountains out of every little molehill that's on that thing. But there's nobody standing on. I was hoping there'd be like a woman in a dress standing at the corner, but there isn't. How big? Where I'm going with this is, how big is the property when you're doing your walk of the Vancouver Barracks?
The actual length of the walk is. It's about a mile. Let me see. About a mile and a third. The Vancouver Barracks itself is a half-mile wide, and the current footprint is a half-mile wide by about 3/4 of a mile long. And of course, I can't take a tour group to do the entire length of everything. So we start off at the parade ground, and we walk west, and then we cross this one street, and it's called Fort Vancouver Way, and the west portion of the barracks is owned by the city of Vancouver. The south portion is owned by the National Park Service, and I don't have a license to do the tours on Park Service land, and so we walk through and amongst some of the older buildings that are owned by the city, and Officers Row, which is where the ground house is, and Officers Row is pretty self-explanatory. Those are the residences for married officers. Those are all owned by the city, so we walk in and around those. We don't get to go into any buildings because, remember you were talking about happens, the buildings get old unless they're taken care of. The city owns them, they maintain them, and in order to pay for the maintenance, they rent them out. Right. So it's not that easy getting into them simply because they're office buildings or people live there, the Grant House being the exception because it's a restaurant. And they're pretty open and friendly about this. Oftentimes, before or after the tour, my patrons will stop in to use the bathroom because there's no bathroom on the route, and it's just a fabulous, beautiful post. Most of the buildings date from about 1908 backward in time, which is really kind of nifty because, again, not a lot of buildings around, wooden buildings, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, Canada included, are really that old, that are still looking pretty much as they did in the first decade or two of their existence.
Mm-hmm. Until somebody like in Canada here, someone comes out from Eastern Canada and says, "Oh, you don't have old buildings here. Back where we are, they're from the 1600s, so we're going to tear all yours down."
I know, yeah.
But then we won't have any old... Oh, too late. Swans.
Yeah, I ran into someone who thought that, and this is true, maintenance on these old buildings is more expensive than if they were brand new. So somebody suggested tearing them all down and building replicas that did not need to be retrofitted with high-speed internet and that kind of stuff. And just trying to explain to somebody it's not the same. It may look the same, but no, it's not.
Yeah, you may as well go to Universal Studios and some back lot because it's just, it's not. Jeff, your tours, and what I kind of like about it too is if you're a member of the Clark County Historical Museum, it's $15, and general tickets are $18. So for under $20, you get a very good, not only historic walk through the Vancouver Barracks area, but you get an actual ghost tour, which is, basically, you listen to all the stories and the history of the building, plus all the creepy stories that have come out of it. And who knows, if you're lucky enough, you might be the author of the next creepy story for the next tour. If you get your hat pulled down over your eyes and your skirt lifted up or something. I hope you're not wearing a skirt. But the Jeff, it's kind of breezy.
It's okay, but we do have stuff happen, even walking the grounds.
Yeah.
And for instance, when I do the tour and it's toward October-ish, it's dark when the tour starts. I have kind of a staff, and I hang a couple of LED lanterns off of it. And in a couple of places where I stop, one or both of the lamps sometimes will start flickering, which an LED, when the batteries are going out, it doesn't flicker. It just gets dimmer and dimmer. Mm-hmm. And then when I finish telling the story and we start walking again, they'll start working normally again too. And we were 2 years ago, I was on the porch of the post hospital, which dated from about 1904, and it was a hospital until about 1940. Horrendous period in medical history. We were on the front porch, and there was a pounding underneath the porch. Like, you're standing on the porch, and I could hear the banging and feel the vibration. And you've been around long enough to know sometimes you do have to ask everybody with you, do you guys hear and see this too?
Mm-hmm.
And they did, and one of them went off the porch and looked through the grill work, the ventilation, kind of the little ventilation holes underneath the porch, and there was nobody there to make the banging.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And when you were saying that the 1904 to 1940, pretty grisly time in any kind
medical
of fort.
history.
It's
a
lot of it, and I learned this by going up to Fort Worden in Washington State. Is the Spanish flu?
Mm-hmm.
People in the First World War were shipped back to the U.S. suffering from the Spanish flu, and instead of obviously sending everybody back to their hometowns and letting it go from there, they were restricted to the military bases, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people died along the West Coast in military barracks or bases in the infirmaries they had there, all of Spanish flu, and it was horrible.
Yeah, and that hit the Vancouver Barracks as well. And talking about medical history and medical theory, because of the ever-present fear of tuberculosis from the 1700s, 18 to early 1900s, these hospitals had very high ceilings, but they also had open decks wrapping around some of these hospitals. And if you had a respiratory disease like tuberculosis or the flu, they thought one of the best things for you was sitting in the sun, regardless of the outside temperature and humidity levels.
Wow.
And during the flu, the hospital was so overmaxed that they just set up outside patient wards on the porches of the hospital and any other buildings with porches to just handle the thousands of sick soldiers.
Yeah, I would even bet there would be a lot of tents for them out there, like in whatever space they could, with the number were coming every month from Europe.
Yeah. And sadly, as a historian, they at that time it was kind of a international secret, of course, because even though the armistice happened, the war was still not over, and they wanted to keep the casualty information low. And so there's not a lot of good historical documentation about that internationally, or even at the Vancouver Barracks. They were making all these statements in the newspapers talking about, we had several hundred people with the flu, but by gosh, nobody died. And then I'm on the microfiche and I'm flipping to the obituary section. Oh no, people died. Yep, here's this person and that person.
Yeah.
Which is how it got the name Spanish flu, is because the actual starting point for this flu, they're not sure, but they were trying not to, in again World War I days, they were trying not to either blame the Germans for it, or they were not releasing casualty figures in England or France, and it was Spain that had the most information in their newspapers about who was sick and how many, and that's kind of how they got pegged with the name Spanish flu.
Yeah, because us in North America, we just perceived it was all happening in Spain.
Yeah, but that's not true. They're not actually sure where it started. Even now, I challenge anybody to start Googling where did the Spanish flu start. And I even heard China as one estimate.
Flu starting in China?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The French brought a whole bunch of Chinese workers for the war effort to do engineering and digging ditches and all this other manual labor, and some of them brought with them their own pigs and chickens. And so that is one theory. I'm not saying that they're the carriers, but that's behind somebody else's theory.
Oh, that's fascinating. I wonder if it goes back, the Spanish flu was actually the avian flu or something like that. or a strain of that. Amazing. Is there a cemetery at Fort Vancouver?
Yeah. Well, I always try and differentiate. See, Fort Vancouver being the Hudson's Bay Company.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yes.
And the Vancouver Barracks being the Army. But you are correct. The Hudson's Bay Company had their own cemetery, and unfortunately, when the Army moved in, the Hudson's Bay Company's moving out, the Army's moving in, and the Catholic fathers who were at the mission there said, "We're not Hudson's Bay Company employees. We're not leaving." And they didn't. The Army did not successfully evict them until the 1880s. And so they had their own cemetery, and the cemetery was used until the 1850s. And the Army decided to move, and the Army established their own cemetery in a different location. So there was kind of an abandoned Hudson's Bay Company era cemetery and the Army cemetery. And in the 1880s, the Army said, we're going to move the cemetery. And in the documents, it's not quite sure, but we know they missed some of those Hudson's Bay Company era graves because they were doing some maintenance on one of the buildings and found the grave.
Okay.
And people believe that building, the auditorium, is haunted for that reason.
Well, that's interesting that they've moved the military and left a few of the straggler old ones around. But it's at the time, they're not military personnel, so why were we going to move them into a military graveyard?
Well, I think they may have tried, but bear in mind it's the year 1880, and some of these people died in the 1820s, and their grave markers were wood.
Yeah.
And some of them they just missed. It's not clear as to how great an effort they put into it. Again, because the Army had been arguing with the Catholic fathers who weren't leaving. Was this just another bit of so there?
Yeah. On
the part of the Army, I don't know.
Yeah, fascinating. And where can if I want to get on one of your tours, I can go onto the website. I can go to the ghostsandcritters.com, click on Maine, click on the Spirit Tales of the Vancouver Barracks, and go down to, you can buy them through the Clark County Historical Museum. If we just show up, can you buy tickets if we were just to show up, or should you get them in advance?
Well, it's better to try and get them in advance because we're walking along sidewalks. I try and limit the tour size to 25 people. For the other thing, it's a better experience. Have you ever been on a ghost walk where you have 50 people? Mm-hmm. It's just, I might as well be refunding money. It's just not that great of an experience. And so oftentimes I am not completely full, so usually there are 3 or 4 spots open or more, and so if somebody just showed up, I would try and accommodate them unless we're completely full, and then for the sake of a greater experience, I'd ask these people to come back another time or make special reservations for them. I know some people don't like online ticketing, so I'd try and accommodate them however I could.
Okay. Yeah, I've been involved in taking people on ghost tours of an old gold mine, and unfortunately everybody met in the bar for an hour before the tour, and it was like herding cats. That's when you're in my case, the paramilitary training comes in handy. It's like kind of having to put a block on a bunch of kids, and not kids, these are adults, but they're intoxicated, so it's like herding 2-year-olds because they don't listen. But it's interesting, and I'm glad that you're doing this for the community down there. This is a fascinating tour, and I'm definitely going to be taking it. I may end up taking it next week. Just going to check the dates here. It's it's one of the tours that I'd like, because I like the Pacific Northwest. I think our access to the ocean really and a lot of the rivers running to the ocean creates a lot of energy, where if you are going to see something that goes bump in the night and then look at it and see it's there, you're most likely going to see it because of they can draw from the energy of the land and the ocean, or the movement of the water. It's like in the rain, going out on a stormy night, being able to see more. It's just that there's more energy in the sky, more energy going on, and we get to see a little bit more and hear a little bit more. Mind you, in a thunderstorm in the rain, you're going to hear a lot of thunder and rain, but we do get a lot more voices and a lot more activity and a lot more connection, whether it is pushing you in the back or flipping your ball cap off, that kind of thing. But it's fascinating, and plus being a barracks, those are fun. Those are interesting, just on a historic level to go through. Which I think would be fascinating, because you would mix his history with the spookanormal, the paranormal kind of conversations that the people would be interested in.
Yeah, and because the Vancouver Barracks were probably the single largest employer within Clark County, Washington, for decades, a lot of people settled here, and so they're kind of living history in a way. A good number of the people who take the tour are veterans or from veteran families, and they kind of talk about energy. It's a kind of a living place to them too. It's because it's within their family memory, and that seems to really, I guess, make it special, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
And so I love having people like that on the tour. I love having people from out of town on the tour too, because then I get to show them my favorite place. So this is one of these things where I guess you'd say doing these ghost walks and the book publishing I do is a hobby that pays for itself. And just keep coordination with me when you're passing through. And if you're coming through on a weekday, just let me know, black out a couple of hours, and we'll just walk around. I'll give you your own personal tour.
Oh, that'll be very cool. What I'll do is end up probably miking you up, and we'll have a conversation, and we can use that.
There's a free podcast for you right there.
Yeah, there you go. And for you.
Yeah.
How many books have you published?
Well, it's kind of funny. Some of them are in a second edition. What I put on my website is written or contributed to a dozen books. Is probably closer to 14 if you count, revised editions. Most of them are on the paranormal and paranormal history, but there are a couple military history books as well.
Nice. I've got 7 piled up here, and what I love these. They're only about 188 pages, so that's a good afternoon sitting on the porch read. Before the sun goes down, anyway, because they're kind of spooky. But the trifecta here I have is that Critters and Sacred Places of Washington and Oregon, and that's something that I am fascinated with. What's the other book I have here? A Haunted Tour, Guide to the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver, USA Ghosts, Volume 1, Portland's Rose City Ghosts, and Haunted Astoria. These are all about the same length. They have pictures. It's the only reason I've got them. And as if I had to read a book without pictures, I'd end up drawing my own in the corners. But fascinating. They're easy reads, and go to the website and pick them up. They're actually a lot of fun. And if you are from Cascadia and you live up in the Pacific Northwest, or you're just interested in this part of the world, it's got a lot of local ambiance, and you'll probably want to move after you've read a few of them, because you live in a very haunted location.
Well, thank you. What a great review of my work. Thank you so much. I'm glad you like them. I'm sure you've met authors who feel that people should buy the book because just because the book is so good, and that somehow the audience owes the author. I feel the opposite. We authors and publishers are nothing without people who like our work.
Yeah, and these are, like I say, I am not somebody to sit down and read a novel. I don't read nonfiction. I don't read fiction. I only read nonfiction. I love the interest. I love anything to do with this part of the world, and also, of course, the paranormal or supernatural, or somebody else's opinion on paranormal and supernatural. Hey, this is a quick question for you. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of a thing called Patreon?
Yeah, I have. I was going to actually talk to you about that because, as your audience knows, we're this will be edited down a little bit, and I was thinking about recommending to you to get a Patreon account because I'm sure you have little clippings too.
Yeah, what I'm doing for my Patreon is that because I'm a retired Mountie, I don't have any bills thanks to some lovely real estate sales we made, and I have a pension. But I love to travel and I love to hit the conferences. So what I've put out there is if anybody wants to sign up to our Patreon and go to the website, theoracleswithjamestyson.com, and sign up for $3 a month, after we hit about 20 people, we'll start drawing 3 times a month, one for a psychic reading, once for a past life regression, and once for a serological chart. And I'll draw names for that out of those 20 people. But hopefully by the end of the year we get a bit higher. And if we get up to like 2,000 people, I will draw names for trips for 2, airfare, accommodation, and car rental. And if you want to go to a UFO conference, like the International UFO Congress, which bounces around all over the planet, actually. This year it is in Phoenix. I think last year it was in Australia. If you want to go to something like that, I'll send you. If you want to go to Gettysburg, if you like ghosts, if you ever wanted, your bucket list includes the Winchester, I would say Winchester?
Mystery House,
Mystery House. Sometimes I say Remington. I throw those off. But if you want to come out of the Pacific Northwest and hit every one of these forts, I will do that. And also, like, if I send you to Gettysburg, you're going to go on all 3 of the Gettysburg ghost tours. Is inclusive. So that's what I want to do. I want to keep giving stuff back. And so if you do sign up for the Patreon, it's coming back to you. Your name's going to go into a draw. And if we max out at the 3,500 or whatever that is, we decide to max out at, the trips will be international. So you will go to Glasgow. You will go to Australia. You could end up going to a UFO conference in Portugal. They have a nice one down there. Or you want to go see ghosts, you can go to London. You go to the UK. You can go to France. And what the heck, I'm only paying for a week, but you got airfare. So while you're there, it's an open ticket. Hang around, do what you want. But that's the way I'm giving back, and that's what my Patreon account is. So just kind of run them by what you thought of something. What would you think of something like that?
You know what? That sounds really nifty. And if people who know me, I don't use the word nifty that often.
So that's a good thing.
I think so too. Yes, it's great. It's a great idea, and it is a really generous redistribution of people's interests. People's interest takes a form of money. It's our society. And so I think that is really generous of you to have such a goal.
Yeah, I hope it works out. And I know if you're a shut-in and you are wheelchair bound and I draw your name, the trip is going to be completely about you and your mobility and how to get to and from things, and we'll make it work. And what I get out of this is I get to go with you, and it's a kind of another reason to interview people and bounce around. So I would rather take people with me that have the same interest in what I'm looking at. And life is short. Let's go do this and bounce around the world. And then if you are living in Ohio and want to come to the Pacific Northwest and hang out with Jeff and on his tour, and my gosh, he can take you into places you'll never want to go to. What is the scariest place you've ever been to, like where you actually consciously had a fear come through you? And I mean this more on the paranormal side. I don't mean this on the military side of things. So,
like that one time in Oregon E in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah, not one of those.
Yeah, and like a lot of paranormal investigation wise, usually your earlier paranormal investigations before you have a chance to get jaded or experienced, so that if something happens in your first or second that's kind of paranormal or anomalous, it scares the living daylights out of you. Like 10 years later, you take it in stride. And I don't know how to take this one in stride, though. It was my first big paranormal investigation was at the Vancouver Barracks, and it did take place in the post hospital. and it was just this whole series of incidents. Toilet seat lids going up and down between visits, camcorders shutting off only in one room, shaking of tables, all kinds of things like this, and all in a building where a previous investigator claimed that she was chased out by the forces. Hold a second. By the forces of darkness itself. And so that was simply because so many things happened that even now I still can't explain. And if it happened to me even now, I would probably still I'd be more inclined to play Mr. Spock from Star Trek and just say fascinating. But it was just an intense experience.
You mean you wouldn't be like a certain fellow on a certain paranormal TV show that would run screaming down the hall after his 10,000th paranormal investigation? Yeah, I find I'm the same as you. It scared the bejiggers out of me when I was a kid, when I was first doing paranormal stuff. They said, well, they think there's a ghost upstairs, and of course we'd go in at night and everything's dark and we've got all these night vision things, and I'm thinking, why am I wanting to go upstairs by myself? Mm-hmm. And it's the fear of the unknown, the anxiousness as you're walking up the steps. And I've walked towards houses where people have guns, and I'm not that scared. Yeah. Because your mind's it's a different. Yes, you're scared, but it's taken over by, it's that mental muscle memory of training. So it goes really quick, and then afterwards you have time to go, holy crap, I could have died. Your fear is it's hard to explain. It's almost like battle fear, where you're terrified. And then something is, a long period has passed, and then you're terrified again, and you think back and you're going, oh, I wasn't scared from point A to point B. Yeah. I was just switched on. But in these cases, you weren't switched on. Your spidey senses and your radar is spinning, and every movement of a hair on your arm is I was grabbed by a ghost. No, it was just nothing. That's the more fear. It's like walking into those goofy haunted houses you go to at a carnival. It's something could happen, and your imagination is what kicks you in the ass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And talking about spiritual quote, I don't want to say spiritual dangers, but the spiritual unknown versus what is a dangerous situation. After all this time in the military, I can't go to like a rock concert because of all the stimuli around me. But I could still stand in front of a crowd of people, screaming "Death to America" without turning a hair. Mm-hmm. Because then what you're up against. It's this whole the unknown of the crowd in a rock concert, and the music bouncing off the walls and people screaming and standing around and waving their arms. It's that unknown. You can't pinpoint the threat.
Yeah, I got to ask you this: when you dream, do you know you're dreaming within your dream?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't.
Okay. Do you still wake up between 3 and 4:30 in the morning?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not just my prostate.
No, it's you're familiar with the different aspects of being an empath?
No.
Okay. One of them is you get agitated and anxiety in large crowds. If you were at a concert and everybody liked the band, and you liked the band and you were focused on the band, you'd feel like you're 3 feet off the ground. But if it was an agitated crowd, or if it was a really nice concert and you left and there was a big fight outside, that agitates you. And then someone says, so what was a concert like last night? And you say, it's kind of creepy. It was agitating. It was like, it was okay. It's because it was a really good concert, but the emotion you felt and you had in memory was this crap at the end of it. That knowing you're in a dream when you're dreaming is the textbook definition of lucid dreaming. empaths are, and which is what I was talking about when we were down in the Oregon Ghost Conference, is the empath or higher vibration people with a Irish, Scottish, Welsh, if you're Caucasian anyway, that Welsh, Irish, Scottish, Scandinavian, Northern Europe, Balkan kind of gypsy, lived close to the land or the earth about 300 years ago kind of vibe to them, are more First Nations if you were Caucasian. We're more connected and therefore more likely to see things, hear things, and we wake up between that 3 and 4:30 in the morning. Usually because it's when we're kids, we'd open our eyes and there'd be a shadow there, and you'd just roll over and go back to sleep. But a lot of us block that out, and that's what was waking you up, going, "Hey, Jeff, could you give me a hand? I've been trying to get your attention all day, but between 3 and 4:30 I can, and all you do now is get up and go pee. Damn you!" And when you were a kid, you'd roll over, see these things, and you'd shut your eyes and go to sleep. But that lucid dreaming thing is a real clue. And they say only depends on whose study you follow. See, not a lot of people, scientists don't study empaths. They studied lucid dreaming. So one study says 17 to 39% of the population have lucid dreams. Others are in the 20 to 23% range, which is what I kind of drop to. And and those are the people that are also experience a number of anxieties when they were kids, and your friends would always say, "Oh man, I feel so good after talking to you." Well, yeah, because you just dumped all your crap on me, and you walked away, and now I've got to deal with it. We gravitate to jobs where we like helping and like finding things, whether we're engineers or artists or musicians or teachers or medical staff or anything like that. We want to help other people. We want to make other people feel good. And those are other little keys of being an empath. And I think you're one of those guys. I think you're just a higher vibration person. And it's coming. I think you're going to end up having your experience where you're actually going to see something, and you're going to concentrate a little bit more of what you just saw out of the corner of your eye. And you're going to see them in the corner of your eye, because that's where we have our best vision sometimes, is that peripheral. So pay attention, young man.
Look forward to it.
Google empath. Gosh darn it. Because that is something that's interesting. It's not all woo-woo and crystals and unicorns. It's actually it's very interesting. And a lot of people in the military are that way inclined, and you can actually connect it to post-traumatic stress too. The Operational Stress Injury Clinic up here in British Columbia for military and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police suffering PTSD, when I was working with them, everybody were higher vibration people. And it wasn't what they saw or what they did, it was how management treated them after they saw or did something. And that's what really got them into the whole idea of that, where they were reliving the event over and over again. It was strictly on their experience with the management over their activities. So yeah, it was really interesting, a very, very interesting thing. So I've completely went sideways off of what we were talking about, but
That's okay.
I really do want to come down and do the Vancouver Barracks now. This is a fascinating location.
Yeah, it is. For so many reasons. As I point out to people, if you're just interested in the history, it is unique because as a snapshot in time, architecture-wise, it is Spanish-American War to what people call the Philippine-American War period. Almost most of the big buildings date to pre-World War I. And during World War I and after and World War II, they removed most of the buildings they built. So you've got this wonderful pre-World War character, so that you go to these other big army posts, and you got you've got 80 or 180 years worth of buildings, but they get in the way of each other. It's very pastoral looking. If you just even want to walk around it, forget the ghosts, forget everything else. You've got beautiful trees and landscaping and this big open green parade ground. So come, bring a book, bring your dog too. And yeah.
Do you ever yourself run any recording equipment like digital recorder or anything like that when you're on your tours?
Not when I'm on my tours. I have had some people, and they've asked me beforehand, and I said, yeah, it's okay if you record some bits of it, just don't put it all online. And so far nobody's gotten anything. However, a couple people have gotten anomalies in photographs. And I did do EVP attempts in the Grant House, and this is the interesting kicker. We were getting ready to start the EVP, and I said, okay, we're going to start on 3, 1, 2, and there was banging and clanging outside the room 3 times. And so the person who was with me went and yelled at the staff for making noise, and it turned out they weren't the ones making their noise. We think that we had something anomalous that was not just for the digital audio. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It totally makes sense. I've heard things with my ears that haven't been picked up. Like a group of us have heard something audibly, and it's not on any of the recorders, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Or it's on one person's recorder and not the other two. It is the weirdest phenomena that you'll get. You'll get a voice, an actual answer to a question, like, what's your name? Marcus. And you'll hear it out loud, and only one person gets it on the recorder, or nobody hears it, and 2 people get it out of the 3. It is the weirdest phenomena when it comes to recording EVPs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would just love to, somewhere around between 5 and 6 in the morning, set a digital recorder up and have it come on right smack dab in the middle of the parade square and just let it run.
Yeah, and that would really be interesting.
And see what you'd get if you get residual sound of marching as for morning parade.
Yeah, and something like that happened in inside one of the buildings where it's dark 30, as we'd say in the Army. Guy is upstairs, and he heard people call to formation in the room below him, and he ran in there, opened the doors, and there was nobody there. So yeah, ghostly formations have happened.
That is very cool. We run into that up in Port Townsend and in Fort Worden up there. The parade square actually, and you can rent out. It's accommodations. You can use it for conferences and things, but you can rent out the officers' quarters. The line of officers' quarters they're raised and overlooking the parade square. But the parade square is, I think it's now grass. Maybe it's always been. And you get up in the morning, it's just covered in deer. But one of the most haunted locations is the museum, which is one of the old officers' quarters, the furthest one on the right, if you're looking at the parade square, if you're standing there right now listening to this. But each of those officers' quarters, they're active. We were sitting in the living room. There's no TVs or radios, and the 2 people came walking down the hall, and we all looked up, waiting for them to come around the corner, and they never did. It was fascinating. And then there was the other ranks had quarters in there, so they were more of a dorm setup, and they were pumping. They were quite active, as well as the morgue, which is actually cute because it's underneath the elementary school that's there now. It's turned into the hospital that was turned into the elementary school, and downstairs the morgue still exists the way it was in I think it shut down in 1952 after the Korean War. But my gosh, what an active place! And Port Townsend, it's basically surrounded by water. It's just constantly moving, so the whole place just rocks of energy, and the dead can really tap into that. So I love forts, and to come down to the Vancouver Barracks and even just walk around. I'd love to. I understand I think there's a Medal of Honor recipient in the graveyard down there too.
Well, they're actually
an astronaut, possibly. I don't know.
The astronaut part I'd have to check on, but the post cemetery now is about a mile away from most of the other barracks buildings. Back in the day, it was part of the post, but the current cemetery, I do guided tours of that, and I don't charge for that. That part I wouldn't feel right about, but there are 4 recipients buried there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, making it, I think, tied for the 16th or 17th most recipients in a United States cemetery.
That's very
And
cool.
yeah, there are not that many. There are not that many graves. 3,600 graves or something like that, which really for a military cemetery is not that many. And so to have 4 Medal of Honor recipients there, a couple of generals, and they moved the graves. So at least some of the older graves are there as well, some of the older bodies. And so if you want to go visit there too, that's about an hour-long tour. And then we can get back in the car and head to the south end, which is where the ghost tour is.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking of West Point with the astronauts. Sorry, for some reason.
I'm sorry. There is a Hudson's Bay Company employee's grave marker there. We're not sure if his body's there, though.
Interesting.
This is around the time of the United States, the Army arriving, and there was the guy's name was John Charles, and he was the son of one of the other factors up in the Canadian end, and they used to do these big rendezvous marches all the way from Canada overland down to the Columbia River and go down the Columbia River and go to Fort Vancouver, and they were on their way there, and they were in one of these upland meadows, and John Charles was actually shot, oddly, by an American civilian employee of the company. And they initially buried his body in Canada, and the known facts kind of end there, but there is a red sandstone marker to him in the post cemetery.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, and at the beginning when we were talking about the Kanaka, the Hawaiians. Now that's something that people outside of the Pacific Northwest or this part of the world may not understand. But the Hudson's Bay Company hired, didn't take them as slaves. They actually hired and paid people from Hawaii, what we know as Hawaii now, as to work on the ships because they were phenomenal sailors. And a lot of them actually moved. And just like the Scottish, the French, and the English who lived on this side of the continent, they didn't bring women with them, so their wives were the First Nations, the American Indians. So the Kanaka and the Hudson's Bay people, unless they were wealthy enough to bring a wife over from Europe, they were marrying the local population here. And we have at Fort Langley, one of or a couple of the apparitions are these big, like 6 foot plus black guys. And someone said, I don't know, who were they? They must have been slaves. We're going, no, those were guys that we used to work here. Those were Kanaka. And not too far away, there was a place called Kanaka Creek, and that's where that name came from.
Yeah, and the majority of the civilian employees of the Hudson's Bay Company, of the non-gentry, the non-management, lived outside the walls of the stockade, and they called that place Kanaka Village.
Oh, you actually had a Kanaka village there. That is fascinating.
Yeah. There is a lot of information available through the National Park Service about that. They've done excavations off and on, and it's interesting. Parts of that got when the Army moved in, the Army took over, and parts of it became like a coal depot dump. And so they have to dig through, of course, the newer layers of the U.S. Army to get to the older Hudson's Bay Company layers.
Oh, that's wild. How long have you been doing this? When did you first start going around with the more of the paranormal side of things?
Well, as I said, I'd always been interested in it, and what really spurred me to do the books and focus on it was, oddly, 1994 to 1995, my wife and I were living in England, and I was working on my master's in archaeology, and I went to the University of Sheffield. And this, if you want kind of a snapshot of what Sheffield looked like then, there's the old movie The Full Monty came out around that same time. And Sheffield was going through really bad economic times. The steel industry had gone down, and they'd always been a blue collar town, and that was one of the problems. I'd been looking for something to take home as mementos for family or friends, and I was looking for something having to do with Sheffield, and there was not that much. Well, I couldn't afford 19th century Sheffield's silver plate. Anyway, I went to this little gift shop, and they had this one woman had done the equivalent of she'd written her own book, typed it up on regular paper, and then she'd taken it to the equivalent of a Kinko's and run off a whole bunch of these ghosts of Sheffield. And each book probably cost her $1 to print up, and they were selling for the equivalent of $5 a piece. And I said, you know what? If this woman can do it, so can I. And so when we got back, I went back to doing archaeology, but there was a layoff, and so I just started working on what I called a Ghostly Guide to Clark County. And I did the same thing. I went to Kinko's and published it, and the money I raised from that was seed money for my first book, which was Ghosts and Strange Critters of Washington and Oregon. It's out of print now. And then there were some production problems with that, and so I asked my wife's permission to spend extra money and immediately publish the first one you've got, Ghosts, Critters, and Sacred Places, Volume 1. And so I found myself the owner of a very small publishing empire, and just the other books seemed to flow from that.
Oh, fascinating. This is really, this is very, very interesting. And I would love to have been in Sheffield. And I look at it, and you describe it back in the Full Monty kind of days of just cobblestones and brick row houses, but and dark, cloudy, polluted kind of coal skies. But I guess it was a little bit after the coal part of things. But just to study archaeology in Great Britain, like, my God, you just dig up the front yard. If you had a front yard, and just keep digging down, you'll find something.
Yeah, well, they had to. They ended up there. It's interesting. My wife went on a volunteer dig, and they were working on a Georgian, like George the First through the Fourth period, like a country estate, and they wanted to identify the kind of the boundaries of the garden written about in like 1720. And so the ironic thing is they went ahead and just got shovels and just dug through the Victorian part and said, we're not concerned with 1840 and afterward. And to us Americans, like, what? 1840? You don't want 1840? Because, of course, Vancouver Barracks was established in 1849.
Yeah. That's crazy. It's still you're digging around there and you're going back, back to 100 AD, and digging up stuff. Or every so often you hear about a farmer working on a building and digging down and finding a mosaic from a Roman country home, and probably they do what they do here when they find some historic dig is they don't tell anybody and just build a house there.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden the universities come in and say, oh, you'll have to move now. We're taking over your entire farm and turn it into a archaeological dig.
Yeah, well, I can't say sometimes that happens because universities don't have that much power, but sometimes on people's property they can find some amazing things. There was in Washington State a guy who owned property in the country found the remains of a mastodon and he was from Manus, Washington, and so he started the Manus Mastodon Site Museum.
See, and that's something you can't do in Canada, because if you dig down, you're a farmer and you dig a hole and find a Tyrannosaurus skull, it becomes, and I can't remember the term for it, but it belongs to everyone in the entire country. So then is managed by the federal government. So the federal government sends a team in to remove it and put it into a museum of their choice.
Yeah, there are a lot of European laws that are similar to that, and I'm going to get this wrong. And so if you're heard in England, wait for the kerfuffle. But in England, as far as things that are valuable, gold coins and things like that, and jewelry, they have a distinction between if something is abandoned or lost, or something that's actually treasure. That is, somebody knew the value of these items and deliberately hid them to come back later but forgot. And so if somebody, and they allow people, metal detectorists, to go into farmers' fields, they're only allowed to dig to a certain depth in the plow zone, technically. Mm-hmm. But if they find something, and I believe if it's treasure, when they find it, it belongs to the Crown, i.e. the British government. But if it's abandoned, it becomes the property of the finder. So if somebody had some gold or silver coins in their house, and then the house burned down, and you found those coins, they're yours. If it's treasure, there's still some kind of a whole compensation that goes on, where yes you found it, and yes, you're owed something for finding it, but the disposition of the artifacts is the government's job.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think Florida has some interesting rules about treasure off the coast too. A lot of, as a result of all that lovely Spanish gold at the bottom of the ocean off the Florida Keys and in that area, I think it belongs to the state, and then you make an application for a portion of it.
Yeah, and mixed in with that is, did the insurance company pay off on it or not? Then it belongs to the insurance company as salvage, and so on. So, yeah.
I would just not tell anybody. Where'd you get that Tyrannosaurus head? Oh, go look in the hole in the backyard. It's got nothing to do.
No, actually, it's what? You mean you don't have one?
Yeah. Well,
everybody does.
Yes. Crazy. I'm talking to Jeff Davis. He is an archaeologist, obviously. He is I'm going to call you a paranormal writer, because you are. You're a paranormal investigator because you actually go out and investigate things and write about them. He's got a number of books. Please go to his website, because if I list them off, I'm going to be here much longer. His website is ghostsandcritters.com. Again, that's ghostsandcritters.com. Jeff Davies, I want to thank you for giving me the time today and dropping by. And I want to reschedule with you, because I want to talk about the critters and sacred places of Washington and Oregon. I'm going to be down in that area again. Hopefully I'm going to drop in at, the Shanghai Tunnels maybe next time down there too, and do a little bit of a tour down there. I also want to talk to you about haunted tour guide to the Pacific Northwest, because I know my listeners are going to be very interested in that, because, you should if you're going to sign up for my podcast, and you end up winning a trip for two. I'm probably, if you live in the Southeast, I'm going to bring you up to the Pacific Northwest. If you're not going to go to an international one, you may just want to stay in the U.S. of A. as a result of that DUI charge. No, I'm kidding. And also Vancouver, USA Ghosts. I want to talk to you about every one of these bloody books, darn you. And again, thanks very much for giving me the time. And I know we've gone a little bit over, but this has been fun. I've learned a ton about specifically the Vancouver Barracks and Vancouver, Washington.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. It's been fun too. I so enjoy things like this where we can chat and go into depth better than being on AM or FM radio station where they want you to give the meaning of life in the universe in 3 minutes or less between commercials. And it's a testament, too, to the audience that you attract, that they will be interested in hearing this in depth. So I enjoy the chance to kind of reach out, touch them through your listenership. And God forbid I'm making the signs of the horn. Nobody pirates your podcast and puts it on their website, too.
And if they do, bless them. Off it goes. It's as long as more people get to listen, I'm good. I'm not here for fame or money. It's just I'm here to because I had, just like you and your podcast. Every day we wake up and every time we experience something, it gives us another 100 questions we want answered. And the best way to get them answered is to ask somebody who's experienced them, like you.
Absolutely, and to you too. And I'm going to have to go back up to Canada soon.
Yeah. Okay. Again, thank you very much for dropping by and spending some time with me and catching up, because this has been fascinating.
Yeah, and thank you too for inviting me, and thank everybody for listening.
That's it. Let's roll. And hey. Let's be careful out there.
Far over the snow, what are those voices? They sing as they go. What are those voices? Look up for the mountain. Through the hail, like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. We are after you, dead or alive. We are out to get you, dead or alive. And forget your soul. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after now. Run through the hail. Angry wolves on the trail. Dead or alive, we are out to get you, dead or alive. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after. No!
I see dead people.